In a post-COVID world, educators and students in the U.S. face a myriad of challenges that demand innovative solutions. Agile's Teachers as Frontline Workers video series shines a light on the sometimes harsh realities in learning today in order to raise awareness and inform a broader understanding of the education landscape. In part 2 of this year's video series, we reconnect with featured expert and clinical psychologist, Dr. Sheryl Ziegler, to discuss how technology continues to reshape education and how educators can prepare themselves and their students. Join us as we take a closer look at factors behind the rapid acceleration of learning technology over the last few years and the impacts in schools and classrooms today.
Welcome back, Sheryl. I'm excited to talk to you again today. When we left off with the first video, the most recent video for this year's series, we were discussing mental health, managing mental health and neurodiversity needs in the classroom. And today, with our second video, we are going to be focusing in on technology in education and ways that it can both help and hinder learning recovery. So I guess just to maybe frame today's discussion, I'll ask you, with the acceleration of new learning technology over the past 2 to 3 years, what impacts are we seeing in schools and classrooms today?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is this is a part of a 3-part series. And as I was preparing for this, I was thinking of how they also nicely go together. So if someone's just hopping on because they're like, yeah, I'm very interested in the technology, I would actually also say, try to listen to the other ones, because I think putting it all together really, I think, gives us a good state of just what's happening right now with technology and mental health and all those things in the classroom. So thanks for having me on again. What I thought one of the ways that, what we talked about when we were preparing this is talking about how technology actually helps learning recovery. And I think that people, not everybody realizes that we're still in learning recovery. And even when, years from now, maybe we're not feeling as much in learning recovery, this is just in learning. And so, yes, there's a lot of things happening and changing. And there's such a wide variety of feelings about technology in the classroom. Sometimes it depends on how long someone's been teaching or what generation, how much they grew up with technology or not. But one of the things that I think is really helpful is that the learning gets more personalized. So if you have a teacher who, maybe wants to teach a certain lesson, all of a sudden you've got technology as a tool to almost be adaptive. So to have this adaptive learning experience, if one student needs more advanced math, they can put them on this track and they can be doing that. Someone needs additional help. Someone is a slower processor. So I think that the individualization is something we can really take advantage of in helping these kinds of gaps. There's also so many online resources. There's everything from videos to apps to interactive lessons, digital textbooks. There's all this opportunity to really tap into, now let's say a different subject like English, you're interested in this kind of book or this type of genre, or science lessons, maybe again, for the learning gap, maybe a science teacher's on one lesson, but a child isn't caught up there yet. They can use those kinds of, all different kinds of mediums to get caught up. So I think by doing both those things, and then if a teacher is comfortable, has maybe it's funding as well, but has the funding to have a program that really tracks progress, then all of a sudden you've got real-time feedback. You can have feedback, right after a 20-minute session. How did they do? Or maybe every Friday they take a quiz on there. So that piece about, okay, and now I have a measurement tool. So I've got the apps, I've got the different programming, I've got the different pacing, and then I can get feedback and know how to adjust things. I think that's, just to kick this off, some ways that technology can be really helpful.
And I think that does tie in, or it's a good bridge from our first video and discussion, because even though we were really honing in around mental health and neurodiversity, there's always been the how do you teach to the different learning styles, learning out like where students are at their level of learning in one classroom with one teacher and maybe a para in the room. And that individuation that these technologies do offer is definitely a big upside. So how are some ways that you have seen or that you recommend that schools and teachers can leverage technology in an intentional way that can really, tangibly improve learning outcomes?
Yeah, I think you actually probably have one of the biggest tips in the question, which is being intentional. So what can happen, which I really understand, it's actually even starting to creep into mental health as well, is you're a teacher and all of a sudden you've got all of these options and you have to choose one, right? And so then it's like being really intentional, maybe having that measurement of what is most needed in my class. So I'm sort of thinking there's probably two routes, right? There's some people who may be a middle school or a high school teacher and they are a science teacher. But there's also elementary where and some middle schools where you are teaching 4 different subjects. You're teaching everything. And so I think that one of the ways to set teachers and students and districts up for success is to say, what's one area we're going to hone in on? We're gonna essentially have a test pilot. Almost, it's a beta, right? We're going to test out this program and track. And so what happens, and I get it because I can be impatient or overzealous, is, oh my gosh, no, I read so much about this thing. Oh, I want to include that. Let's just do it this year. And you make this investment, and maybe it doesn't have the outcomes in your population, excuse me, like it does in others. And so I guess the researcher brain side of me says, be intentional, choose one area, beta test it, study that over a school year, see if it really made the kinds of gains that it promised to, or it didn't. Again, other studies or trials, almost be in trial. So again, I understand we have learning losses to make up for, and we just want to keep advancing our students. However, I think with technology, this is still evolving. And so taking it at a pace that can be measurable is probably the biggest takeaway that I would share with people.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, we kind of not the shiny new thing approach, but really being deliberate and organized about it. And it's something that in the solution provider side of the conversation, you hear a lot of recommendations to providers that they do, pilots and programs that show the outcomes, and then do it in different sort of populations and different district profiles, so that then they're able to show a district in one part of the country with a very unique set of students and their population and teachers, how it would work for them, and really being able to have that evidence-based approach, so that they don't end up going full in on a product that may have worked wonders for, a student population and community that is entirely different from theirs.
Yeah, I think about it like curriculums. This happens, right? And there's sometimes very frustrated teachers where they're like, we have changed our curriculum 4 times in the last 5 years, or, things like that. Well, that takes up a lot of time and energy for a teacher to learn a curriculum. And in this case, to maybe learn the new technology. They have to get trained on it. They have to make sure they have the right hardware for it and right software and the right Wi-Fi speed. And there's a lot there. And then if after 1 year, if you go all in, that will feel really defeating. If you say we had a sample and maybe this isn't it, I don't think people feel defeated. I think they're like, okay, now we're open to it, to something new. So there's a different mindset when you're all in versus you're in testing mode.
And, I think the pilot approach also allows a school or a district to, after going through that, before they decide to do a full launch, is to really understand what the training and orientation needs are to scale that out across their faculty. So it's as least disruptive as it can be to them actually teaching in the classroom. And it's not a distraction that they're just spinning their wheels and trying to learn a new thing while also needing to, rise to all the challenges of teaching in the classroom in the first place.
Yeah, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about it as well, when you can be measured like that, let's say after 1 year, you say, yeah, we did have great results and this is something we want to go forward on. Now, maybe you've got a teacher or two that's in the building that's like, oh yes, here were the glitches. Here's where I got tripped up. Here's my experience versus, even somebody else coming in. It's like, I think it's received differently when it's a colleague of yours. It's like, okay, I've been doing this for the last year and here's everything that I learned about it as well, which I like because I know how much having new technology in spaces can just be frustrating for some people or, be received so differently. So I think to have somebody you can walk down the hall that you're comfortable saying, I'm not understanding this, or how do I do this, or how do I manage this, is also, I think, a factor in the efficacy and the enthusiasm around the investment around it.
It's almost like it is achieving a train the trainer approach so that you have that subject matter expert in the building and you're not reliant on, maybe potentially inaccessible in the moment of need support for how to make it work for your students, your classroom, and the place that you work. You have someone there who's gone through it and can, again, just be that resource for it to succeed across the rest of the school. So we've talked about ways that technology is enhancing and can really improve, from an educator's perspective, the learning recovery process. But we also know, as users of digital media and phones ourselves, that it also has another side of that coin, whether it's complicating things in the classroom or just distracting. Would love to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say, I already said, I'm an advocate. I think we need to embrace AI and these kinds of things. It's here to stay. However, we have to be real. I mean, we know that technology is distracting kids. We know that technology is addictive. We know that there's overuse. We know that kids are on screens for so many hours a day, both in school now and out of school. And so I think there's a very real thing. I mean, there's articles about I actually had someone on my podcast once talk about, she does some sort of, classroom audits at Stanford or something. And she said, I sat in the back of the class and the majority of the class was online shopping, gaming, watching a YouTube video. They're not paying attention. It's too tempting to have technology right there. And not, be distracted by it or just be completely not on task. So that's very real. I also think that, if we've touched on it, but it can significantly reduce in-person interactions. That's, another piece of data that we know. They say, again, particularly in college, but, kids get primed for this in high school, especially when they're allowed to have their phones, which is they're talking so much less. It's quiet in a cafeteria because people have their AirPods in. People are just doing, scrolling or whatever it is they're doing. And so there's just a lot less, human interaction, which is, of course, a concern. And then there's a reliance on, I really don't have to think that hard. I just got to know the right question to ask, put it in, formulate it a little bit for myself, and I've got my answer. So I think those are, some of the top ways, in addition to what we kind of touched on already, which is the concern around cheating and the concerning around plagiarism, the concerning pieces around, creating images that are, not real, but look incredibly real. It'll be very, very hard to know that they weren't. And just, monitoring in general, just all kinds of ways that we've seen, social media is a good one, but AI is right behind it in terms of something that can be so positive and can be so connecting and enriching can also go awry. I think it's worth, of course, acknowledging that that's very real and something that has to constantly, I think, be monitored and discussed and taught. And that's why, parents as partners are really important, but also students getting, in my opinion, again, a K through 12 kind of education constantly that's updated, that's constantly checking in, is really very, very important.
I think your point about it's going to evolve over years and, quite possibly our lifetimes. I've heard a lot of commentary on AI being as transformative over that longer time period as the internet was. And I know you and I were both alive before, or at least, young before
Yes,
the internet
definitely.
was around. And now when we're, 30, 40 years post that, and you can see a lot of the both good and pretty scary ramifications, I think it's important to acknowledge that it's here. You can't pretend it's not going to continue to be there. And so embracing it and putting some form and expectation that's shared between the educators and students as each of those populations kind of evolves with the technology, is it just knowing that it's going to change and that not either ignoring it or just jumping on every new thing. Like neither of those are going to work. It really does take that intention and, not just pretending that, oh, you're not allowed to use it, that's cheating, but really looking for those middle ways where it can be a shared sort of partnership for the good uses of it as it's, becoming more integrated. And again, it gets better from the first time we were using it a year ago to now, today. It is not an uncomplicated challenge. I mean, even from having the cell phones in class and are they even paying attention? You see schools that have done the bans or they keep them in bags at school. And then when we have violence at schools, like recently, then there's pushback on that. So it feels like the center, there is no center. And if there ever was, it certainly won't hold. So, again, it's, I think what we value these conversations with you so much for is we want to be as clear-eyed about, not how hard and negative everything is and not how wonderful and optimistic we are about all the new shiny things, but the reality of it and how do you work within how it is today, knowing it'll be different tomorrow, but that the responsibility and the importance on integrating that into school, because students, it's happening now, and there are very positive things that we could be leveraging these technologies for, but we also have to own the same responsibility for the other side of it and doing what we know of now that could also help prepare students for those sides of it in their future as well.
And I guess as I hear you kind of summarize that, I do think about some of the concerns, and they're very real, and I don't want to minimize that. I mean, I think, one of the first areas of concern are really artists and creators. That could be, illustrators and artists that paint or draw, or, songwriters and authors and people who maybe feel like their work is literally being lifted. And there's no regulation around this yet. And really, it's interesting. Like for some reason, it seems like art isn't maybe as protected. Like right now, let's say, I don't know, like this is just today, but it's sometimes hard to get information from books because they seem to have more of that copyright protection around them. But those are pieces that absolutely need to be figured out. And I know that there's, communities of creators that are very upset, that feel like their work is being lifted and that's not being monitored or regulated or monetized for them in any way. I also think that there's equity and access issues. There's that piece around, there are still pockets of people around the country that don't have access to Wi-Fi, that don't have access to stable, internet connection. And so when, that pertains maybe to all technologies, but when we look at AI, I think we also think, oh, this is open source, this is free. Yes, there's paid versions, but there's also free ones that do a ton. And there's still that access issue, which I think is worth reminding people, because I think there are going to be pockets of the country that assume that everybody has equal access. And that's just absolutely not true across populations or towns or districts. And, I think we saw that. I feel like during the pandemic, I'll never forget the story there. I don't know why, but it just stood out to me that there were kids that were going to wherever they could to try to get Wi-Fi access off of other businesses or places just so that they could log on. And I think that's one of the things that highlighted.
Definitely. And the point you made initially about just the ownership, and that could mean from both, like the artist perspective, but also from the validity of the sourcing from the student perspective. But it reminds me a lot of, I worked in publishing early in my career, and it was right around the time that ebooks was coming out on Google Scholar, and the digital rights management just crisis that took the publishing world totally by surprise, surprisingly. But it's again it's disruptive, and we've been through many of these before. So I do think just encouraging deliberate intention, but also just an understanding that it's here, it's not going to go anywhere. And so it's just about how do we use it as responsibly as we can. And also in a way that's preparing the students for a future of digital literacy and digital citizenship that isn't going to be optional.
That is like reminding me of, probably a whole new category. Like we have, even digital citizenship. That's a term that didn't always exist in our lifetime. And just the ethics around deep fakes, the ethics around manipulating photos. Me personally, I've covered a lot of stories over the last 2 years around, issues that have come up in middle schools and high schools around just, terrible situations in which people's images were manipulated, and they're incredibly realistic. And that's, of course, that's on a student level. We see it on the bigger levels, famous people, and I'm sure they care a whole bunch about that. But when I'm thinking about children, and I'm thinking about developing adolescents that have tools to hurt people, to really destroy people's reputations and things like that, there's a strong ethics piece that has to be implemented into digital citizenship curriculums. And even that, I know we're going to get into it, maybe is a good time now, and then digital citizenship curriculums also need to be strong and updated and probably pretty uniform in some way or consistent in some way, depending on which one you use, so that students all over the country are getting very similar kinds of training and education around it.
Absolutely, because that'll be sort of an equity-related skill set when they're out of school that, again, will just be an expectation, even though all the things you mentioned, accessibility, and the fact that I don't know if there's a lot of standardized digital citizenship curriculum out there that would sort of level set that expectation of knowledge when students are out of school.
I would love to take a minute and talk about it because I've been on the digital citizenship. I wish I knew the exact date. I could probably get it, but I think I have been teaching digital citizenship in different ways, I think since 2018. And I've used the Common Sense Media model, and I've also, or curriculum that's out there for free. And I've also done Google's training as well. And so there are curriculums out there, and they're out there for free, and they're good. They're really good. And let's just say they were even just okay. Okay is better than nothing. But you can start this probably before kindergarten, but this is like a K through 12, in my opinion, type of issue that could even be put into health curriculums, because the way in which you use technology and interact with it, and, that could include AI, but that could also extend to social media and things like that, I think have real implications on the overall health and ability to learn for our kids. And so I'm really pretty passionate advocate around digital literacy being something that's offered to every student.
Well, and we'll share in the notes of this second video some links to the examples that you shared, because I think, I feel passionately about trying to get more, information about those out there, because I have a middle schooler and a high schooler, and it has definitely changed the conversations I expected to have with children about not just learning, but like you said, the ability to do harm, and them having to have a self-awareness that at their age, I certainly didn't have to have, or probably could have had. And, I think something that starts that awareness training and I just sort of grounding them in that, because we know that that's the world that we already live in, and it will look different by the time they're adults. Really anchoring them in those sorts of skills and awareness is really important. Kind of backing out a little bit from, best practices and ways to make it, to make learning technology, new technologies, effective and rollouts go well in districts. There are recent examples like LA Unified's AI pilot breakdown, and that makes it pretty understandable why some educators may feel cautious or even fearful about being too reliant on technology. So and that one is a recent one just because it was earlier this year, but what are some things that we can learn from these examples about how to approach the use of technology in learning? We just talked about one, but maybe just building off maybe a recent, not failure, but just sort of a too soon to launch and having to roll back, and the effect that probably has on morale and motivation to try something again at that scale. Can we talk a little bit about ways that the acceleration of generative AI in the education space is impacting things?
I mean, this feels like this is the topic of the year, right? Like they have like covers of Time magazine, person of the year. This is like the topic of the last, I think, 2 years, 2023 and 2024. So, just so we're all on the same page, generative AI, that could be OpenAI, ChatGPT, now Google has Gemini. And so the first thing to say is that the impact is significant. And I think in really positive ways. I am a fan of AI. I am a fan of embracing it and learning it. And just like everything we were just talking about, it's going to take years, and that technology is going to keep evolving. So I think we're almost committing to saying it's probably here to stay. And the commitment to years means probably actually your lifetime, because it's going to just keep advancing more and more. And in some ways that really concerns people. But it's transforming really education, and things like, obviously plagiarism and integrity and learning and critical thinking skills. And, before it was like, oh, you don't even have to think that much. You can just Google it. But still within Googling it, you still did have to be discerning, like, okay, is this site as reputable as this one? And, even just a Wikipedia, do I trust Wikipedia? And, those things. And it took a couple of years. And a lot of times on assignments I see now in parentheses, the teacher will say, you may not cite Wikipedia. So I do think this is ongoing. But one of the things that I think about is just first the positives. How it can enhance the learning environment. How can you still teach critical thinking skills, which I think will always be an incredible piece of intelligence. But how do you still teach that when you can ask ChatGPT, anything at all? And, if you're not discerning, you can just take it for what it is and just move on. So I think that there are ways, like somebody was just telling me yesterday, actually, it was a really advanced student. They're in college and they are going to be an engineer. And I just made, just sort of a statement that said, well, obviously you're good at math or something like that. And they said, actually, I really struggle in math. And I said, really, in your engineering program? And she said, yeah, so I use ChatGPT to tutor me. And I was like, oh, that's a new one. Like, what do you mean exactly? Because she has to, of course, show her work. So she just basically said, I'll tell it that, I did this problem and I arrived at this answer, and could it tell me step by step what I should have done? So just that little example is like, yeah, maybe we think of it almost as a tool to cheat, but it also can be a tool to teach. And I think it can also be, like people will write And that's one of the biggest concerns. Well, I think the technology will keep advancing as well to say, this looks like this was generative AI, but I don't think there's anything wrong. I have done it before where I'll put in a sentence or a paragraph and I'll just say, make this funnier or make this, whatever, better written or more concise. And for me, I guess I don't see it as that much more different than an editor in a sense. It's still my words and I'm asking for help in a sense. So I think that there's ways that you can use it to enhance learning. I think there's ways that teachers could use it to be more efficient. I think that, instantly sort of starting off a class, whether that's, middle school, high school, college, and saying we are all aware, of course, there's ChatGPT, and being really clear, which I think a lot of college professors are doing, a lot of clarity around, here's how I'm okay with you using it. Here's my policy around it. Here's how I'm going to check. It's no different than, years ago before these things existed when you still could have plagiarized off of other sites or even books. I remember being a kid and saying, I was told to do this. I have one citation. It's an encyclopedia. And I pretty much wrote verbatim what was in the encyclopedia. I didn't know much more than that. So I think it's just getting to a comfort and a boundary and a definition. So sorry. And then just, talking about I think presenting it to students as this is yet another tool and we're going to embrace it. And this is today what I think this looks like, and this may continue to evolve. I mean, I think that's a starting point. I knew that we were going to talk about some of these pilot breakdowns. And so I really wanted to look some things up. What are, lessons learned? Because you've got short-term lessons you learn sometimes, and then time just will tell long-term lessons. But right now in the short term, I think it seems probably a top lesson learned is almost how I started this, which is teachers that are not maybe adequately prepared. They're not adequately trained. They lack, that sense of experience or confidence to be able to not just implement it, but keep it going and grow with it. And resistance. I mean, there's teacher resistance for many reasons, whether it's anything from, oh my gosh, is my job going to be replaced, to wow, I think I have a group of students who don't know how to think for themselves, to straight up resistance around just, I don't like it. I'm not comfortable with it. I don't want to use it. But I'm being told I have to. So I think the first short-term lesson learned is that it's adequate training, it's adequate ongoing support, but it's also buy-in. You've really got to have buy-in. You're not going to have 100% buy-in, but you've got to have enough buy-in, because we all know if you try to push somebody to do something that they're really against, it doesn't tend to go very well. So if I were an administrator and I was wanting to use this, and I clearly know, okay, this group of teachers are really resistant, they're not excited about this, I would address it. I wouldn't force it on them and just say, too bad, this is what we're, not that anybody says too bad, but sometimes it feels that way, like, well, we didn't have a say in this, and this is what we have to do. But really talk to them about it and say, we're really going to do this, but you're leading it. So what can we do to best support you? What would be comfortable? So I think that is foundational. And then after that, it's really, I think when we look at these breakdowns, there's been, one of the things that I have in here that kind of just addressed, but I said buy-in, but it's also like a collaboration. So how do you collaborate and with something you don't even fully really understand? So I think that collaborative piece in terms of how do you communicate this to parents at home so that they're also learning alongside of you? How do you still have things like group projects and ways that kids are having to interact with one another, and that you don't look back and go, oh my gosh, we piloted this program and I realized how little team collaboration time there was between students, which we know group projects, they have a lot of positive outcomes. Kids have to know how to speak up, how to assert their ideas, how to disagree with others. Like, those are skills that are not ever going away. And so I think, being really intentional and mindful around, we still need human interaction and collaboration and teamwork. So how do we do that? And then also, I think one of the things that has come out of this is just understanding, or just at least noting, what are the limitations? What were the breakdowns? Where was something cited that it wasn't accurate? Are we giving feedback to, ChatGPT asks you, was this helpful? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Was this accurate? Is that important to us? Should we be feeding it the data back? And so it's interesting because I have a tech person that I work with, and we have conversations pretty frequently, and he teaches me something new about it all the time. And the latest thing that he taught me was, he said, you are training this chat GPT. You're training it. You and it are having an interaction. And so I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? He said, well, like in the morning, because I have ChatGPT open a lot. I use it. I personally use it a lot. So he'll say, in the morning, you should tell it good morning, and you should feed it the kinds of questions, like the kinds of even words that you want back. So I say things like, good morning. Today, when you respond to my questions, they will be academic, scholarly, intelligent, whatever it is I want. And like, that's not something that I even knew. I never thought that I was training this model really per se. So just things like that, like understanding there are limitations, understanding there are ways to train it, which I didn't understand. Understanding that it's very much in progress. I think those are that level of trust and that level of patience as well is part of what maybe isn't always fully appreciated on the front end. And so then when there's a huge breakdown or a failure of sorts, they're really worth reflecting on, learning from, and then growing from there.
And also beyond, that just sort of that engaged relationship, rather than you're just, going to a source to give you an answer, that, that perspective, I think, is really valuable. But then also to your point earlier that, when you're approaching technology integration or a new rollout across, either all teachers in a school or more broadly at a district level, really considering it as an additive and not a replacement, and not anything in totality. It's just another thing. It's not going to replace the things that we know are still going to be core skills students have to get out of their education experience, but it is an additive that can accomplish all the things we've discussed before about individualization and efficiency and insight into where different students are at a different point. But it's just still one piece. It's one tool that education is able to integrate and use, not a replacement.
I don't work full time in a school, so maybe it's easier for us to say this, but it really comes up time and time again that that's a pretty high fear for teachers, their sense of replacement, their sense of just hesitancy, anxiety, even fear of not just being replaced, but just fear around what is this doing to education. So, I think the resistance to change, and also just, confusion and unknown pieces around change are very, very real. And that's why doing these things slowly and intentionally and, piloted are really important. Even, just piloting out, I think would be really cool, like in an innovation type of environment, a year where, I don't know, you do use ChatGPT maybe every day or with a subject, and you learn from it, and then you report back from a student perspective, a parent perspective, and a teacher perspective. Like, I just made up a study, but I think that would be a really interesting year and really interesting, kind of qualitative and maybe some quantitative feedback on what was that like to really intentionally embrace it, bring it in, and use it on a daily basis.
And I mean, also the point of acknowledging the fear behind the pushback, not that it will be the same from the same source for every teacher, but early in my career, I trained educational technology, trained faculty at at universities, and it was 15 years ago, but I got very used to just a paralyzing fear just about it being on the computer, it being something that they just felt they weren't native to. And so by acknowledging that up front and building it into your implementation plan, not worrying, oh, we'll deal with it if we come across that crop, they're there. And it's just a known. So, you need to have planned in for that. And it's not, like an influence campaign to try to make them less scared. It's much more about equipping them with the skills, not just expecting them to, and then go on the fly in the classroom. So kind of in that vein, what are some ways that you've seen or you would recommend that districts could support teachers in continually developing their own technological skills and integrating new tools and practices into the curricula? And it could be about something that they're about to use or just digital skills in general, because, we talk about, like, we use artificial intelligence ourselves, you use ChatGPT, but a lot of people don't still, if it's just not in their world or it's not of their interest, and it can feel like it's moving really, really fast and it's always different. And so just any thoughts on how districts can be proactive and supportive?
I think probably an order that I would do it if I were in this situation that I wanted to start implementing greater technologies or AI would be, first and foremost, I'd probably take a climate survey, right? So I'd want to get a good gauge of level of openness, resistance, acceptance, enthusiasm, right? I'd want to know that. I think that it really depends on the school, and so you can't make assumptions around it. So I would personally start with that, probably make it anonymous, so that people could hopefully feel as comfortable to share as possible. Then once you make a decision, you have to commit to that ongoing professional development and training. And that's something to really figure out, when are you going to do that? How are you going to do that? Is that going to be live, pre-recorded? Is it mandatory? Is it optional? I think that piece, of course, is essential. And I think most people probably have a sense that they need to do training, but the ongoing piece is really the key word here, the ongoing piece. And also do we have an in-person go-to that maybe isn't absolutely knows as much as, the person who sort of developed it, but they are a go-to person. Having an in-house person, I can't emphasize enough. And that depends on the school, whether they have somebody like that, a tech person, makes a really big difference. I think also having, I kind of mentioned it before, but I didn't couch it this way, but it like you were saying, a train the trainer kind of model. I think like a peer support model, not just like, oh, I'm comfortable, with Jane down the hallway and I can ask her questions. And so Jane and I have that rapport. She knows a little bit more and I'm learning from her. But maybe my younger colleague or newer to the field colleague over here doesn't really know somebody. So they're at a disadvantage because they can't just, or they don't feel they can just go to a colleague. So instead of it being highly informal, at least having some sort of formalized peer-to-peer support network or mentorship or just partnership. And even if you laugh and say, well, I don't know if I know anything more than you know, I think two heads together trying to figure things out is better than one person wondering, am I the only person? Who do I go to? So I think that's really important. And then, I had mentioned earlier, like, how are you going to do that ongoing training? I think what the data shows, and this isn't just to education, but in a variety of fields, is that if you can offer a whole option, an array of ways that you can get training, people tend to respond to that well. Some people will say, yeah, I don't mind sitting in bed at night and even just listening to an audio. Somebody else might want to watch a video and, learn it on Zoom. It might be pre-recorded. It could be live. And then, some people want someone physically there, hands-on. So I think that's one of the positives. There are a variety of ways that people can learn and consume ongoing education. And I think offering at the very least more than one, but two or more will also increase engagement and confidence around, use of technology.
And, the point about the two heads are better than one, but having at least some designation and some organization around, who is sort of the the touch point in the building, but also if two other people come across something, they figure something out, that there is a sharing model or vehicle so that best practices can be continually developed internally and then shared broadly so that everyone is, able to gain from the new knowledge that might be percolating throughout the classrooms in a school or throughout schools in a district.
It actually also just made me think of something though, that I haven't overtly said, but I just want to because it's a small but major point, which is, yes, be intentional about what you're rolling out with technology, but also be really mindful that you're not also rolling out different initiatives at the same time. So you don't have a new reading curriculum in the same year that you're going to decide to use, ChatGPT or OpenAI, as a additive tool. I think that is really tough. I think you need to have some stability in other areas to be introducing something that we already know causes teachers, probably even more than students, a significant amount of anxiety. So just really being mindful that there are a ton of other changes going on the year you decide to roll this out.
Another point, and just sort of building off what you were saying about professional development in general, and where people see the best outcomes is sort of having these multiple, I guess, format options, whether it's in person, asynchronous. And that's something that with technology, having trained in technology and just knowing how my own brain engages with learning new things, it's iterative and it also requires retread. So in your work with schools from a professional development point of view, have you, I know you'll come in and you might do things over webinar, but are there best practices about keeping, whether it's documentation, on-demand access videos for that individual teacher who at any point during the year might need a refresh, or just reminding about one piece of maybe a larger new skill set that they had learned as part of this, professional development focus?
Honestly, adults are similar. We're all human. We're similar to children in that many adults are motivated by incentives. So whether that's, you get your continuing education, you get some continuing education credits, or you get some professional development hours that are included, or that you get paid for the time that you are taking out of your normal work day. And I know that might sound like a stretch, but I'm just talking about all different kinds of, I think, incentives and rewards that do keep teachers, at least engaged and motivated to continue to grow in the area versus getting stagnant or frustrated or not really fully doing it because they don't know where they're going to get the time. They don't want to do this on their own time. They are intimidated by it and it's not pleasant, So I think those kinds of, credits and incentives are really important. And I also think just it's as basic as it sounds is be asking for feedback. So meaning administrators ask for feedback and make that not, maybe once in the middle of the year and then once at the end of the year or just at the end of the year. But I am always hesitant to say like we're adding more things to teachers' plates because I know there's already a lot. But I do feel like even if you have like a way in which a place that people can ask questions, or you designate X amount of minutes out of, staff meetings to just say, okay, quick tech check. How'd it go? What's the temperature in the room? Anybody have any questions? Anybody have any successes? So even if it's short and it's not a deep conversation, you're gauging on a weekly basis, how is this going? And share some feedback, or you have a board and, you have a pros and cons kind of board, So just, I think those are the kinds of things, those are mistakes that I see in general when people are trying to implement change in any kind of system, is there's a lot of, anticipation for the change, usually excitement from people who are initiating it, and hesitancy or anxiety from the people who actually have to implement it. And then not enough check-in about it, not enough tweaking throughout the year. So you wind up speaking at the end of the trial period and finding out all sorts of things that maybe you could have been finding out all the way along if you were just checking in. And again, it's quick check-in. So, and if something major comes up, you then carve out time later on to say, okay, we're going to do a deeper dive into that later. That sounds like that was a big deal yesterday kind of thing. So I think those are some ways to have it hopefully launch more successfully.
and that the checking in, not just from the one by one experience, but also so you can monitor if you're seeing trends of, we're seeing this a collective of different people having this issue. And I really loved what she said about the celebrating successes in those check-ins. And I wonder, have you ever seen with schools and districts you've worked with, let's say they launch something at the beginning of a school year and it's this full year, whether it's a pilot or just a new rollout of something that they plan to continue to use. At the end of that year, coming back and giving sort of a retrospective and like, here's where we are today, here are wins, here's changes that we can attribute to this thing that you all took on and took the time and the learning and then sort of uncertainty in the beginning of the year, like coming back and really showing them results in another sort of incentivizing, motivating way. Is that something you've ever seen schools do?
I would say that more often than not, those kinds of things come out what feels like about a year later. And because they'll implement something, they'll want to do it for the whole school year, they'll take the summer to analyze the results, and then maybe they kick off in the fall by saying, hey, last year we piloted this, or we implemented, this social emotional learning curriculum, and, here's some data. And so I think that's probably more the norm, where if we could have more frequent check-ins, or even just, it doesn't have to be really rigorous, but just even anecdotal, right? You have most principals or leaders of schools will send out a weekly kind of summary of the email and have a little corner, right? Have a little box that says, we just implemented, it's so exciting. The fifth graders are using, this open AI program, and here's some things, even if it's qualitative. It keeps people aware of, we're monitoring this. We're not just waiting for the big data. So I can't personally think of, I'm sure there are, but I haven't personally been involved in any that I thought went really well, like along the year. And I understand some reasons for that, because you don't want to prematurely say, oh, we're seeing such great results. And at the end of the year, you go, oh my gosh, actually, there were no gains made. I don't know what we were saying in December, right? So I understand the need for some rigor, but again, when implementing a program, I think the critical assessment of it and framing of what we're going to report to you on, hey, we're doing this thing, it'll take a year before we really know, but on a monthly basis, we're going to give you an update how we think it's impacting your students or our classroom or our building, and being transparent about that.
And I think also keeping it on the priority radar, like having that, if it's that important to take, this time and focus and just all of the work that it requires, keeping it up front and center, that it's being monitored, that it's being valued. And, I almost can see the successes along the way, whether they're data backed yet or not. It's almost more of a way to keep the motivation to give that pilot of the year the best chance to actually show results. If you're keeping people plugged in and motivated by other people's successes or curious about how they accomplish them, that'll all pan out in the real data. But to even get there, you need to keep people on task and aware, but also motivated and inspired to keep doing the hard work of taking any brand new thing on at, a scale level, like a school or a district.
Absolutely. And I want to acknowledge, because my experience has been less, of course, with like a technology program in this way, but much more with like, again, a digital citizenship curriculum or just an SEL curriculum. But one of the things that I'll say is that it's one of those things that you don't know the long-term data, right? The big picture long-term data till you've got it. It takes time, all of those kinds of things. But we shouldn't shy away from anecdotal, even if the anecdotal is on the negative side. We're not really seeing a change, or those kinds of things. But I think that what I see more of my experience has to do with curriculums. And this reminds me of sort of like adding a curriculum, where it'll just, parents, they got to remember too, parents too don't want to feel like, oh, great, we tried this curriculum for 2 years and it wound up being that it was flat, or kids actually didn't gain at the same rate as the national averages. What a waste, right? So I keep emphasizing all sorts of people, like the stakeholders, because you, especially in a public school district, you don't want to lose that trust or lose that that sense of confidence in your leadership because they say, oh my gosh, we did this one thing. So figuring out ways that you are assessing along the way, that we, assuring people we're looking at this, we're not going to go down, we're not going to commit to 5 years and find out after 5, we're going to commit to this amount of time. Those kinds of things just feel like not just even more effective in making quicker decisions, but also really mindful about the role that stakeholders have, the variety of them, and really including parents in on it too. I think parent training around technology is, I know, yet another thing. But if we want to embrace innovation, technology, and have kids that are doing that right now, they're just so surpassing their parents. Every parent I talk to, unless they are literally like a software developer, they don't know, their kids know way more than they do. And that starts pretty young in elementary school. We as adults use Zoom and we use email and we do very basic things. They're doing things, that I think parents, it's kind of like math even, but that parents feel a lot of insecurity about. Like, they're like, I don't know what they're doing. They could be doing anything. How would I really know? So I think it is really important, if we want to really be successful with this, that we offer parents some inclusivity. We include them in on the education of this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, going back to just the planning before you even start, a rollout of whether it's a curriculum or a new digital technology. And I like you sort of comparing it to being as substantial and it's sort of maybe all encompassing as a curriculum, because it really does, require a lot of the same focus and just disorientation in the beginning for teachers, students, everyone, but that it's not a set it and forget it sort of thing. And also that you need to do a holistic planning and prep that doesn't take into account all stakeholders. And obviously parents shouldn't be easy to forget about that, but maybe if you're just focusing on the building and the rush or need to get teachers up to speed, you can focus all on that and forget that they spend half of their lives outside of that building. And, that, whether it's from, do they have access to Wi-Fi at home, to are their parents able to know what they're supposed to do and then see that they have done it, kind of be that partner at home outside of the classroom. All of those things are, it can sound overwhelming and complicated, but just back to, what we can learn, try to, anecdotes and stories in very recent reality of large scale things that didn't work. It really does come back to planning. It may take a long time to plan it, but that is maybe the most critical part to it being successful, and not losing the credibility from a leadership perspective, trust between, all of the stakeholders in the relationship, that could prevent future optimization or enhancements or improvements from ever getting off the ground. Thank you so much, Sheryl. This was, I love these so much. I could just pick your brain forever and try really hard not to interrupt you with just popcorn thoughts, but really appreciate your time.
You did a great job and you have great questions and it was a really good flow.